Bullies pick on the wrong little girl, completely unaware she was trained by a deadly Marine. They thought she was weak, just a quiet, lonely black girl they could push around. But when they corner her in the locker room, they trigger something they never expected. Because this little girl doesn't scream, she doesn't run. In 6 seconds, she takes them down with moves no teen should know, moves taught by someone who once led men into war. What secret has she been carrying all this time? And what happens when the truth about her past is finally exposed and shakes the entire town to its core? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Ayanna sat cross-legged on the living room floor, swimming in her dad's Marine Corps hoodie. The sleeves hung well past her hands, and the hem pooled around her like a soft cotton lake. She breathed in deeply, catching the lingering scent of her father's aftershave that still clung to the fabric after so many washes. The laptop screen in front of her flickered and buzzed, struggling with the overseas connection. Her father's face appeared in chunks of pixels, breaking apart and reassembling like a digital puzzle. Even through the poor quality, Master Gunnery Sergeant Daryl Cole's warm smile shone through. "Hey, baby girl," he said, his voice crackling through the speakers. "How's my little warrior doing today?" Ayanna didn't speak, but her eyes lit up. She pulled the sleeves back just enough to free her hands and straightened her back, just like he'd taught her. Their ritual was about to begin. "Ready for our special hello?" he asked, his image freezing for a moment before clearing again. Ayanna nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Her father's hands came into view on the screen as he began their personal greeting. Marine hand signals modified just for them. First, he touched his heart, then extended his hand toward the screen, finishing with their own special flourish that meant, "I love you." With precise movements, Ayanna copied each gesture perfectly. Her small hands moved with careful dedication, making sure every signal was exactly right. It was their language, their special connection across thousands of miles. "Perfect form as always," her father praised. "Been practicing those defensive stances we worked on?" Ayanna nodded again, her eyes never leaving the screen. She wanted to memorize every detail of his face, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, the slight salt and pepper at his temples, the way his smile always seemed to start on the left side first. The image stuttered, pixelated worse than before. "Connection's not so good today," he said, his voice breaking up. "But I'll be home soon, baby girl. Just a few more." The screen froze completely. Ayanna leaned forward, her hands gripping the edges of the laptop. She waited, patient and still, like her father had taught her. Sometimes the connection would come back if they just waited. A sound from the kitchen made her turn. Her mother was there, phone in hand, face already wet with tears. Something cold and heavy settled in Ayanna's stomach. Through the front window, she saw it, a dark military vehicle parked at the curb. 2 Marines in dress uniforms were walking up their path, one carrying something wrapped in blue fabric. Her mother rushed into the living room just as the doorbell rang. Ayanna didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, like during their stealth training games. If she didn't move, maybe this moment would freeze too, like the screen with her father's face. But the moment didn't freeze. The door opened. Words were spoken, official, formal words that Ayanna heard but didn't process. Her mother's scream pierced the air, raw and broken. The folded American flag passed from white-gloved hands to her mother's trembling ones. Ayanna looked back at the laptop screen. Her father's frozen smile was still there, caught in mid-word, probably about to say, "Love you," like he always did before signing off. She stared at that smile until her mother's arms wrapped around her, until the laptop battery died and the screen went black. 2 weeks later, Ayanna stood beside her mother at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was crisp, autumn leaves dancing on the breeze. She wore a black dress instead of her father's hoodie, but she could still feel his presence like the ghost of his hand on her shoulder, teaching her to stand straight and strong. The bugler began to play taps, Ayana closed her eyes, and suddenly she was back on their rooftop 6 months ago, during her father's last leave. "Keep your guard up," he'd said gently, adjusting her stance as she threw practice punches at the air. "There you go. Always protect yourself first." His hands had been warm and steady on her shoulders as he'd shown her the proper form. "Being strong isn't about hitting hard," he'd explained. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to step back. It's about protecting yourself and the people you love." The last note of taps faded into the autumn air. Ayana opened her eyes, her face dry but her heart aching. She looked at the flag-draped coffin, at her mother's shaking shoulders, at the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. 2 years passed like a slow-motion blur. Ayana sat in the passenger seat of her grandmother's old Buick, watching the North Carolina landscape roll past her window. They were driving north, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. Her father's hoodie was folded carefully in her lap, and she ran her fingers over the worn USMC letters. "You doing okay, sweet pea?" her grandmother asked, glancing over with concerned eyes. Ayana nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. They were heading to a town she'd never heard of, a place that existed only in the fold of a map on her grandmother's dashboard. It wasn't part of any future she'd imagined, wasn't in any of the plans she and her dad had talked about during their video calls. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Ayana watched their shadow stretch out ahead of the car, growing longer and longer until it disappeared into the gathering dusk. She touched her heart, extended her hand toward the horizon, and added their special flourish. One last silent, "I love you," to the father who had taught her both strength and gentleness. The rusty sedan's tires crunched through fresh snow as Miss Thelma turned into the driveway of their new home. The 2-story house loomed before them, its white paint peeling in places, revealing weathered gray wood underneath. Ayana watched snowflakes dance in the glow of the headlights, each one unique and fleeting, just like the memories she held close. Her fingers found the familiar shape of her father's dog tags beneath her hoodie, tracing the embossed letters she'd memorized by touch alone. The metal was warm against her skin, a constant reminder of what she'd lost and what remained. "Well, here we are," Miss Thelma said, her voice carrying forced cheerfulness as she cut the engine. "It's not much to look at right now, but we'll make it home." The house stood silent and dark, waiting. Through the passenger window, Ayana studied its worn features, the sagging gutters, the crooked shutters, the way the front porch listed slightly to one side. It looked tired, she thought, like it had seen too many winters and carried too many stories. Miss Thelma's boots squeaked against the snow as she made her way around the car to Ayana's door. "Come on, sweet pea. Let's get inside before we freeze solid." Inside, cardboard boxes created a maze through the living room and kitchen. The house smelled of dust and old wood, with undertones of the pine-scented cleaner Miss Thelma had used earlier that day. A bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the walls. Miss Thelma moved through the house like a hummingbird, unpacking boxes and humming gospel tunes under her breath. She pulled out familiar items, the old copper kettle that always sat on their stove, the framed family photos, the hand-stitched quilts that had kept 3 generations warm. "You know," she said, carefully unwrapping a crystal vase, "this reminds me of when your daddy was little. We moved 4 times before he started middle school. That boy could pack and unpack a room faster than anyone I knew." She paused, looking at Ayana. "He got that from your granddaddy. Always organized, always prepared." Ayana nodded, clutching a box labeled A's room in her grandmother's neat handwriting. She carried it upstairs to her new bedroom, a small space with faded blue walls and a window that overlooked the backyard. Setting up her art supplies was like assembling armor. Pencils lined up by hardness, markers arranged by color, sketchbooks stacked according to size. The night passed slowly, filled with the sounds of Miss Thelma's humming and the house settling into its bones. Ayana drew until her fingers ached, filling pages with shadows and light, with memories she couldn't speak aloud. Morning arrived with gray light filtering through bare tree branches. Miss Thelma had laid out Ayana's clothes the night before. Dark jeans, a purple sweater, and her father's hoodie, now washed so many times the USMC letters were barely visible. First impressions matter, Miss Thelma said as she drove them to Maple Hill Middle School, her hands tight on the steering wheel. But remember what your daddy always said. It's not about what they think of you. It's about what you know about yourself. The school building was brick and imposing, American flags snapping in the winter wind. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they approached the main office. The receptionist looked up, her smile appearing and disappearing so quickly it might have been a trick of the light. "May I help you?" she asked, her eyes moving between Miss Thelma and Ayanna like she was solving a puzzle she'd rather not complete. "We're here to register my granddaughter, Ayanna Cole," Miss Thelma said, her voice carrying the same steady strength it had used when dealing with difficult patients during her nursing days. The principal's office smelled of coffee and artificial pine. Mr. Halpern sat behind his desk, a man whose presence seemed to fill the room more than his actual size warranted. His gaze settled on Ayanna, lingering longer than comfortable, assessing and categorizing. "We believe in discipline and tradition here at Maple Hill," he said, shuffling papers without looking at them. "Our standards are high, and we expect all students to meet them." Ayanna met his stare with quiet steadiness, her father's training flowing through her veins. Observe, assess, maintain position. Her silence was not submission, but strategy. After forms were signed and pleasantries exchanged with all the warmth of winter frost, a student aide led Ayanna to her homeroom. The hallways echoed with footsteps and whispers, with locker doors slamming and muffled laughter. Room 203 fell quiet as she entered. 24 faces turned to stare, 24 sets of eyes tracking her movement as she followed the aide to the teacher's desk. She kept her spine straight, her steps measured, just as her father had taught her during their rooftop training sessions. "Class," Mrs. Bennett said, "this is our new student, Ayanna Cole." A girl with perfectly straight blonde hair leaned toward her friend, whispering loud enough to carry, "Is she a transfer from juvie?" Snickers rippled through the room. In the back row, 3 boys exchanged knowing smirks. The first had carefully styled hair and expensive clothes, his smile sharp as a knife's edge. Next to him sat a broader boy with a crew cut, his grin wide and mean. The third boy, slighter than the others, smiled too, but something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or recognition. Mrs. Bennett pointed to an empty desk near the window. "You can sit there, Ayanna." Ayanna moved through the rows of desks, aware of every eye following her, every whispered comment, every shifted position. She sat down, her father's dog tags cool against her chest, her silence wrapped around her like armor. The morning light streaming through the window caught the snow outside, making it glitter like stars. Ayanna was the only black face in the room, but she held herself with the quiet dignity her father had instilled in her. Her silence filled the space around her desk, louder than any scream, more powerful than any words they might throw her way. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime chaos, hundreds of voices competing with the clatter of plastic trays and scraping chairs. Ayanna stood at the entrance, her brown paper lunch bag clutched in one hand, her worn sketchbook in the other. The noise pressed against her like a physical force, but she kept her face carefully neutral as she scanned the room. Every table told its own story, the athletes clustered together, their Letterman jackets bright splashes of school colors. The drama kids gestured dramatically over their lunches, scripts scattered between milk cartons. Even the quiet students who usually sat alone had formed their own small islands of solidarity. Ayanna moved through the maze of tables, her steps measured and deliberate. At each table she passed, students suddenly became intensely interested in their food or phones. Some shifted their backpacks to take up empty seats. Others simply pretended not to see her, their conversations dropping to whispers as she passed. She found an empty table in the far corner, near the emergency exit where the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. The plastic surface was sticky with spilled soda, but Ayanna pulled out a paper napkin from her lunch bag and wiped down her small section of the table. The chair squeaked as she sat down, the sound lost in the cafeteria's din. Her grandmother had packed her lunch with extra care that morning, a turkey sandwich with the crusts cut off, just like her father used to make, an apple polished to shine, and a small bag of baby carrots. Ayana arranged everything precisely on her napkin, creating order in her small corner of chaos. The sketchbook opened to a fresh page, clean and white and full of possibility. Her pencil moved across the paper with practiced strokes, the familiar motion as natural as breathing. The cafeteria's noise faded to background static as she lost herself in the creation of lines and shadows. Heavy footsteps approached her table, accompanied by snickers and the squeak of expensive sneakers on linoleum. Ayana's hand didn't pause in its movement across the paper, though her shoulders tensed slightly. "Yo, statue." Griffin's voice cut through her concentration like a dull knife. He leaned over her table, his designer jacket brushing against her lunch. "You allergic to noise or just too dumb to talk?" Jace's laugh was too loud, too eager to please. He stood slightly behind Griffin, his crew cut making his head look like a pale egg in the harsh cafeteria light. Ty lingered at the edge of the group, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Ayana continued drawing, her pencil creating the outline of a soldier standing alone in a vast desert landscape. Empty shell casings littered the ground around his feet, and in the distance, explosions bloomed like deadly flowers. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Griffin said, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that meant he was losing control of the situation. His hand moved toward her sketchbook, but Ayana smoothly slid it just out of reach. Ty stepped forward then, his movement almost reluctant. His hand shot out, catching the edge of Ayana's water bottle. It toppled, rolling off the table and clattering across the floor. Water spread across the linoleum in a growing puddle. Two teachers stood by the cafeteria doors watching the scene unfold. One took a sip of coffee. The other checked her phone. Neither moved to intervene. Ayana's pencil never stopped moving. The soldier in her drawing stood firm, his stance wide and ready, his shadow long against the war-torn ground. She added details to his uniform, careful cross-hatching that brought out the texture of the fabric, the weight of his gear. "Freak," Griffin spat, finally frustrated by her lack of response. He turned away, shoving past a freshman who had stopped to watch. Jace followed like an eager shadow, but Ty hesitated for a moment, his eyes fixed on Ayana's drawing before he hurried after his friends. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of whispers and sideways glances. When Miss Thelma picked her up in the rusty sedan, the heater rattling against the winter chill, Ayana slid into the passenger seat with relief. "How was school today, sweet pea?" Miss Thelma asked, her eyes studying Ayana's face in quick glances as she navigated the crowded parking lot. Ayana shrugged, her fingers finding the dog tags under her shirt. The metal was warm from her skin, smooth and familiar against her fingertips. Miss Thelma's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She opened her mouth as if to say more, then closed it again. The rest of the drive home passed in silence, broken only by the pop music playing softly on the radio. That evening, after dinner dishes were cleared and homework was finished, Ayana sat cross-legged on her bed. Her latest drawing lay finished before her, the lines sharp and clean in the warm light of her desk lamp. She studied it carefully, making small adjustments here and there with her eraser. The drawing showed a girl standing straight and tall, her chin lifted, her eyes clear and determined. At her feet, 3 figures lay crumpled and broken, their faces blank spaces on the paper. Their hands reached toward her but couldn't touch her. She was untouchable, unbreakable. Ayana rose from her bed and walked to her door. The tape made a soft ripping sound as she pulled it from the dispenser. With precise movements, she secured the drawing to the back of her door, smoothing down each corner until it lay flat against the wood. She stepped back, considering the image. In the quiet of her room with only the winter wind whistling outside her window, the drawing seemed to pulse with its own kind of power. The faceless figures at the girl's feet weren't just fallen, they were defeated. And the girl, standing tall above them, wasn't just surviving, she was triumphant. When Ayana finally climbed into bed, pulling her father's old Marine Corps blanket up to her chin, the drawing watched over her like a guardian. Her expression, as she drifted off to sleep, had shifted by half a degree, something subtle but significant like the first crack in winter ice before the thaw. The gymnasium echoed with squeaking sneakers and the sharp whistle blasts of Coach Martinez. Students in navy blue gym uniforms clustered near the center court, their faces flushed from warm-up exercises. Ayana stood slightly apart from the group, her gym clothes crisp and new, the white drawstring pulled tight around her waist. "All right, people," Coach Martinez's voice boomed across the space. "Today we're doing team building drills, partner relay races, build trust, build speed, build coordination." He consulted his clipboard. "I'm assigning pairs." The usual groans and whispers rippled through the crowd. Ayana's expression remained neutral, though her fingers brushed against the small braid at the nape of her neck, a habit she'd developed since her father's passing. Coach Martinez read through the list, students shuffling to find their assigned partners. When he called out, "Jace Linder and Ayana Cole," Jace's face twisted into an exaggerated grimace. "Lucky me," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. A few students snickered. Griffin, standing nearby, smirked and made a gagging motion. Ayana walked over to Jace with measured steps, keeping precisely the distance required for the exercise. Close enough to participate, far enough to maintain a buffer zone. Her father had taught her about tactical spacing, though she doubted he'd imagined she'd need those lessons in middle school gym class. The relay involved running to markers, passing a baton, and navigating around obstacles set up across the gym floor. Simple enough, but it required coordination between partners. When it was their turn, Jace barely looked at Ayana as they took their positions. They made it through the first exchange smoothly enough, though Jace nearly dropped the baton when Ayana passed it to him. On the second lap, as they approached the bleachers, Jace's shoulder suddenly slammed into Ayana's side. The impact sent her stumbling sideways, her hip and elbow scraping against the metal bleachers with a sharp clang. "Oops," Jace said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Guess I misjudged the space." A few students laughed. Coach Martinez, focused on timing another pair, hadn't seen the collision. Ayana pushed herself up, ignoring the stinging scrape on her elbow where skin had been rubbed raw. A small trickle of blood made its way down her arm, but she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she resumed her position, her stance slightly adjusted, ready for another impact if it came. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Balance is everything, baby girl. Keep your center strong." The rest of class passed without further incident, though Jace made sure to bump into her, accidentally, whenever Coach Martinez wasn't looking. Ayana moved like water around his attempts, never quite where he expected her to be. When Coach Martinez finally blew the final whistle, students streamed toward the locker rooms. Ayana waited until most had gone before heading to change. She'd learned that timing could be as important as strength, but she'd miscalculated. Griffin, Jace, and Ty were waiting in the narrow corridor between the gym and the locker rooms. They must have doubled back, timing their ambush perfectly. Griffin's hand shot out, shoving her against the wall. The concrete was cold against her back. "You know what I've been thinking?" Griffin's voice was low, almost conversational. "Bet if we cut that hair off, she'd finally say something." He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a pair of scissors. The fluorescent lights caught on the metal, making it gleam. Ayana's heart rate increased slightly, but her breathing remained steady. She cataloged their positions with automatic precision, just as her father had taught her. Griffin in front, scissors in his right hand. Jace to her left, gripping her arm. Ty to her right, his hold hesitant but firm. "Hold her still," Griffin commanded, stepping closer. The scissors opened with a soft snick. Cold steel touched Ayana's braid, and something inside her shifted. Time seemed to slow, breaking down into distinct fragments of motion, like frames in an animation. Frame 1. Her right foot hooked behind Ty's knee, applying precise pressure to the joint. Frame 2. As Ty's leg buckled, she twisted sharply to the left, breaking Jace's grip. Frame 3. Her hip rotated, using Jace's own momentum to flip him over her shoulder. Frame 4. Her hand clamped around Griffin's wrist, thumb pressing into the nerve cluster her father had shown her. Frame 5. The scissors clattered to the floor. The entire sequence took less than 6 seconds. Ty lay curled around his knee, gasping. Jace sprawled on his back, the wind knocked out of him. Griffin stood frozen, his face white with pain, as Ayana held his wrist at an angle that promised agony if he moved. She applied no more pressure than necessary, just enough to control, not to damage. Her father had been very clear about proportional response. "You're not fighting to hurt," he'd said. "You're fighting to protect." The sound of running footsteps echoed down the corridor. A PE teacher, Coach Wilson, burst around the corner, probably drawn by the noise of Jace hitting the floor. "What in the world?" he demanded, taking in the scene before him. Ayanna released Griffin's wrist and stepped back, her hands loose at her sides. The three boys groaned and cursed, struggling to their feet. The scissors lay forgotten on the floor, a silent witness to what had transpired. 10 minutes later, Ayanna sat in Principal Halpern's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The scratch on her elbow had dried to a dull red line. Principal Halpern leaned forward over his desk, his face flushed with frustration. "The security cameras in that hallway should have captured everything," he said, tapping his computer monitor. "But somehow, the footage from exactly that time period is missing. Would you care to explain that?" Ayanna's expression remained perfectly blank as she met his gaze. She said nothing. Principal Halpern's office felt like a cage, with its wood-paneled walls and heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light. Ayanna sat perfectly still in the oversized leather chair, her posture military straight just as her father had taught her. The scratch on her elbow had dried to a rust-colored line, a silent testament to what had started it all. Mr. Halpern leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He held Ayanna's thin file folder in his hands, flipping through pages with exaggerated care. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. "Miss Cole," he said finally, looking up at her over his reading glasses, "would you care to explain what happened in the gymnasium hallway?" His tone suggested he didn't expect an answer, and Ayanna didn't give him one. Her eyes remained fixed on a point just above his left shoulder. He sighed, setting the file down with a soft thump. 3 students are in the nurse's office. Griffin Rourke has a sprained wrist. Jace Miller is complaining of back pain. Tyler Watson has a bruised knee. He paused, studying her face for any reaction. That's quite a lot of damage for one small girl to cause. The door opened, and the school nurse, Mrs. Reeves, stepped in. Her white shoes squeaked against the polished floor. "The boys will be fine," she reported, glancing at Ayanna with poorly concealed unease. "Minor injuries. Griffin's wrist is wrapped, just a precaution. His parents are on their way to pick him up." "Thank you, Mrs. Reeves." Halpern dismissed her with a nod. When the door clicked shut, he turned back to Ayanna. "Did they provoke you? Threaten you in some way?" Another pause, another stretch of silence. "You understand. Your continued refusal to speak makes it very difficult to get your side of the story." Ayanna's fingers brushed against her braid, so briefly anyone else might have missed it, but Halpern's eyes narrowed slightly at the movement. He picked up his phone, pressing a few buttons. "Yes, please connect me with Miss Thelma Cole." He waited, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Miss Cole?" "This is Principal Halpern from Maple Hill Middle School. There's been an incident involving Ayanna." He explained the situation in carefully chosen words, never once mentioning the attack or the scissors. Instead, he focused on the injuries to the 3 boys, Ayanna's concerning behavior, and her refusal to cooperate with the investigation. "I want to assure you, Miss Cole, this is not about race," he said, his voice taking on an practiced, placating tone. "We take all incidents of violence very seriously, regardless of who's involved. Given the severity of the situation, Ayanna will be suspended pending a full investigation." He listened for a moment, his face tightening. "Yes, I understand your concern, but our policy on fighting is very clear." Another pause. "The disciplinary report will note that she used excessive force in what was clearly a non-life-threatening situation." Ayanna watched as he scribbled on a form, his pen pressing hard enough into the paper that she could hear it scratch. Her father had taught her about pressure points, how much force to use, when to stop. She had been careful, precise, just like he'd shown her. 20 minutes later, Miss Thelma burst through the office door like a storm front. Her normally neat gray hair was slightly disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it. She wore her nurse's scrubs from the retirement home where she worked, having come straight from her shift. "Now you listen here," she said before Halpern could even stand. My granddaughter has never been in trouble a day in her life. Something happened to make her defend herself, and I want to see that security footage." Halpern's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unfortunately, the gymnasium camera was under maintenance today. We have no footage of the incident." "Under maintenance?" Miss Thelma's voice could have cut glass. "And I suppose it's just coincidence that 3 boys corner my granddaughter on the one day there's no camera working?" "Miss Cole, I understand you're upset." "Upset doesn't begin to cover it." She turned to Ayanna, her face softening. "Get your things, baby. We're going home." The drive home was quiet, but Miss Thelma's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles showed white. The disciplinary report sat between them on the center console, its official letterhead seeming to mock them both. At home, Miss Thelma made dinner, fried chicken and collard greens, comfort food from Ayanna's childhood. They sat at the small kitchen table, the overhead light casting warm shadows across their faces. "This isn't right," Miss Thelma said finally, setting down her fork. "Those boys did something. I know it, and that principal knows it too." She reached across the table, covering Ayanna's hand with her own. "We're going to the school board. This isn't over." Ayanna looked at her grandmother's hand covering hers, strong hands that had raised her father, that now raised her. Hands that knew both gentleness and steel. Without a word, she stood up from the table, leaving her dinner half-eaten. In her room, Ayanna pulled out her sketchbook and a set of colored pencils, a gift from her father on her last birthday with him. The paper was smooth under her fingers as she began to draw. First, 3 faceless figures emerged from her pencil strokes, their features deliberately blank but their postures menacing. Then came a hand, reaching for a dark braid. The scissors appeared next, cold and sharp against the white paper. Finally, she added the fire. It started small, just a hint of orange at the edges, but grew to consume the entire bottom of the page. The flames seemed to dance, reaching upward toward the faceless figures, promising something that Ayanna couldn't, or wouldn't, put into words. Outside her window, the streets of Maple Hill were growing dark. Somewhere in town, 3 boys were telling their version of the story. Parents were making phone calls. Teachers were choosing sides. The whispers had already begun, spreading from house to house like a game of telephone, each retelling further from the truth. But none of them knew what had really happened in that hallway. None of them had seen the scissors, felt the cold metal against their hair, remembered a father's lessons about control and precision, and when to act. The Saturday morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Hill's main street as Ayanna and Miss Thelma walked toward Miller's grocery. The town was quiet, but not peaceful. There was tension in the air, thick as summer humidity. Miss Thelma's head was held high, her steps purposeful, while Ayanna moved like a shadow beside her, watching everything but saying nothing. People noticed them. Of course they did. In a town this small, news traveled faster than wind through cornstalks. A woman in a floral dress stopped sweeping her storefront to stare, her broom frozen mid-sweep. 2 teenage boys outside the hardware store whispered and pointed. An elderly man crossing the street actually changed direction to avoid their path. "Keep walking tall, baby," Miss Thelma murmured, though her jaw was tight. "We've got nothing to be ashamed of." Inside Miller's grocery, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Miss Thelma grabbed a shopping cart, its wheels squeaking against the linoleum floor. They moved through the aisles methodically, bread, eggs, milk. Miss Thelma kept up a steady stream of quiet commentary about prices and quality, filling the silence between them. In the produce section, a woman in yoga pants clutched her purse tighter as they approached. She stepped back from the tomatoes she'd been examining, muttering "troublemaker," just loud enough to be heard. Miss Thelma's hand tightened on the cart handle, but she kept moving, selecting apples with deliberate care. At the register, Mr. Miller himself rang up their groceries. He was a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair who'd owned the store for 30 years. His movements were slow and precise as he scanned each item, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "That'll be $67.42, he said, finally looking up. Not at Ayanna, but at Miss Thelma. As she counted out the money, he added, voice low but clear, She should have kept her hands to herself. Miss Thelma's fingers paused over her wallet. "Excuse me?" "Just saying what everyone's thinking," Mr. Miller continued, bagging their groceries with unnecessary force. "We don't need that kind of violence in our school." "And what kind of violence is acceptable in your school, Mr. Miller?" Miss Thelma's voice was razor sharp. "The kind where 3 boys corner 1 girl? The kind where nobody sees anything?" Mr. Miller's face reddened. He thrust their receipt across the counter without another word. Monday morning arrived with a bitter chill. Ayanna walked through Maple Hill Middle School's halls like a ghost, her footsteps silent against the worn linoleum. But unlike before, she wasn't invisible anymore. Every head turned to watch her pass. Every conversation hushed, then erupted into whispers in her wake. Griffin, Jace, and Ty had returned to school, and their version of events spread like wildfire through the hallways. Griffin's wrist brace became a badge of victimhood, his story growing more dramatic with each retelling. "She just lost it," he told anyone who would listen, gesturing with his injured hand. "We were just talking, and she went crazy, like some kind of ninja psycho." Some students gave Ayanna wide-eyed looks of admiration. A freshman boy whispered "badass" as she passed. Others pressed themselves against lockers when she walked by, as if afraid she might explode at any moment. The teachers were worse. Mrs. Peterson, who had always smiled at Ayanna in English class, now avoided eye contact entirely. Mr. Roberts, the math teacher, called on her less frequently and stood slightly further from her desk when collecting homework. Even the cafeteria ladies served her lunch with wary expressions, as if she might leap across the counter at any moment. Only in the library did things feel somewhat normal. Mrs. Grange, a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, treated Ayanna the same as always. She nodded hello when Ayanna came in during lunch period, then left her alone with her sketchbook at her usual table in the corner. But Mrs. Grange wasn't as uninterested as she appeared. She watched from behind her desk as Griffin and his friends swaggered past the library windows, laughing and shoving each other. She'd been at Maple Hill for 15 years, long enough to know when something didn't add up. She remembered Griffin's suspension last year for misplacing another student's term paper, remembered Ty's creative excuses for a black eye he'd given to a 7th grader. And she remembered Ayanna sitting quietly for hours, drawing with precise, controlled strokes, military precision in every line. During 6th period, Ayanna left her usual table in a hurry when the bell rang. A piece of paper fluttered to the floor in her wake. Mrs. Grange waited until the library was empty before retrieving it. The sketch was divided into 3 panels like a comic strip. In the first, 3 figures cornered a smaller one against lockers. In the second, a hand held scissors near a braid. The third showed a series of defensive moves drawn with such technical accuracy they could have come from a combat manual. Mrs. Grange's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that hold, the way the smaller figure redirected force, the precise angle of the counterstrike. She'd seen it before, years ago, in another context entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the paper and slipped it into her cardigan pocket. When the final bell rang, she waited until the last student had left before locking the library door. She gathered her things quickly, her mind already in her attic where a dusty legal binder waited. She'd kept it all these years, telling herself it was just for records. But maybe, she thought as she hurried to her car, it had been waiting for this moment. Maybe some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how deep you tried to hide them. The evening sun was setting as Mrs. Grange pulled into her driveway, casting long shadows across her front lawn. Her hands weren't shaking anymore as she climbed the stairs to her attic. They moved with purpose, pushing aside old boxes and photo albums, searching for a specific shade of blue binding. The library was quiet during study hall, save for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of turning pages. Mrs. Grange watched Ayanna from her desk, noting how the girl's shoulders tensed slightly whenever someone walked too close to her table. She'd been observing Ayanna all morning, waiting for the right moment. When the library had emptied except for a few scattered students absorbed in their textbooks, Mrs. Grange approached Ayanna's corner table. Her footsteps were deliberately audible. She'd noticed how the girl startled at sudden movements. "May I sit?" Mrs. Grange asked. gesturing to the chair across from Ayana. Ayana looked up from her sketchbook, her dark eyes careful and assessing. After a moment, she gave a small nod. Mrs. Grange settled into the chair, taking care to move slowly and keep her hands visible on the table. She'd seen that watchful look before, in her years as an attorney. It was the look of someone who'd learned to anticipate threats. "I found your drawing yesterday," Mrs. Grange said softly, sliding the folded paper across the table. "The technique you illustrated. It's very precise, very controlled." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Who taught you that move?" Ayana's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her pencil. For a long moment, she just stared at Mrs. Grange, as if weighing something in her mind. Then, without a word, she flipped to a new page in her sketchbook. Mrs. Grange waited patiently as Ayana's pencil moved across the paper with practiced efficiency. The girl's strokes were quick and sure, each line placed with purpose. Within minutes, a scene emerged. A rooftop at dawn, the sky barely lightening at the edges. Two figures stood in sharp detail, a young girl and a tall man in military fatigues. His stance was protective yet instructional, guiding the girl's form as she practiced a defensive move. The detail in the man's face was striking: kind eyes, a strong jaw, the same quiet determination that Mrs. Grange saw in Ayana's expression. This wasn't just a memory, it was a tribute. Mrs. Grange nodded slowly, understanding flooding through her. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she said quietly. Ayana ducked her head, returning to her original drawing. Back in her office, Mrs. Grange closed the door and pulled out a key she kept on a chain around her neck. The bottom drawer of her filing cabinet opened with a metallic groan, revealing stacks of blue legal binders, remnants of her previous life as a civil rights attorney. She'd left that career behind 12 years ago, burnt out from fighting an endless stream of institutional barriers. But she'd kept the files, unable to completely let go of the cases that still haunted her, the ones where justice had fallen short. Setting the old files aside for now, Mrs. Grange logged into the school's database. Ayana's record appeared on the screen, but something caught her eye immediately. The timestamp showed the file had been modified the day before the incident with Griffin and his friends. Scrolling through the document, she noticed several sections where text had been redacted, replaced with blank spaces. The original notes about Ayana's academic performance and behavior were gone, replaced with vague comments about adjustment difficulties and concerning patterns. Mrs. Grange's jaw tightened. She'd seen this kind of selective editing before, back when she was practicing law. It was amazing how often important details went missing when certain narratives needed to be maintained. She opened another window and began searching through disciplinary records from the past 5 years. A pattern emerged. Every instance of excessive force involved students of color. Most cases were dismissed quickly, with minimal investigation, but one name appeared multiple times in cross-references: Malik Evans. Malik's file was sealed, which was unusual for a middle school student. Mrs. Grange clicked through several screens, her frown deepening. 3 years ago, Malik had been involved in an incident similar to Ayana's, defending himself against multiple attackers. The school board had ruled against him despite evidence of provocation. He'd transferred schools shortly after. Mrs. Grange's printer hummed to life as she made copies of Ayana's original sketch and the relevant documents. Her hands moved with renewed purpose, muscle memory from years of building cases returning. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and wrote a name at the top: Judge Collier. Sandra Collier had been her mentor once, a fierce advocate for educational equity who now sat on the state's Judicial Review Board. She would understand the significance of these patterns, these convenient omissions. Mrs. Grange looked at the growing stack of evidence on her desk. Ayana's technically perfect sketch, the modified school records, the sealed file that shouldn't exist. The school thought it had buried this story under paperwork and procedure, like so many others before it. But Mrs. Grange hadn't spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney for nothing. She knew how to dig, where to look, and most importantly, who to call. This time, the truth wouldn't stay buried. She arranged the documents in careful order, each piece telling part of a larger story. Then she reached for her phone. Judge Collier's number already in her mind. The school board meeting room buzzed with tension. Metal folding chairs scraped against linoleum floors as parents and teachers filed in, their conversations dropping to whispers when Miss Thelma walked through the door with Ayanna beside her. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the long table where board members sat shuffling papers, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Miss Thelma's chin was high, her spine straight as steel. She'd worn her best dress, navy blue with pearl buttons, and her Sunday church shoes that pinched her toes. Ayanna followed close behind, wearing her father's dog tags under a crisp white blouse. When their turn came to speak, Miss Thelma's voice filled the room with quiet authority. My granddaughter was attacked. 3 boys tried to cut her hair, an act of violence with clear racial implications. Where is the security footage? Principal Halpern cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. As we've stated, Mrs. Cole, the matter is under review. The camera system was under maintenance, Miss Thelma finished. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? A board member, Mrs. Peterson, according to her nameplate, leaned forward. Mrs. Cole, we understand your concern, but this is not a racial issue. The school has clear policies about physical altercations. Then why? Miss Thelma cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. Is it always the black kids getting buried under it? The room fell silent. My granddaughter defended herself against 3 attackers. Where are their suspension notices? Where are their disciplinary hearings? Halpern's face tightened. Mrs. Cole, I must warn you about the implications of legal escalation. The school has procedures. Procedures that protect some children and punish others, Miss Thelma finished. She placed her hands flat on the podium. I'm not leaving until I see that footage. The matter is closed for now, the board president announced, tapping his gavel. Next speaker, please. Miss Thelma didn't move. Ayanna touched her grandmother's arm gently, and only then did the older woman step away from the podium, her dignity intact, but her eyes blazing. That night, the crack of splintering wood echoed through their quiet street. Miss Thelma was in the kitchen when she heard it, washing dishes with trembling hands. She dried them quickly and went to investigate. The mailbox lay twisted on the ground, its metal door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, crumpled and dirty, was a note written in jagged letters. You're not welcome here. Miss Thelma's heart pounded, but her movements were deliberate as she collected the note and the broken pieces. She glanced up at Ayanna's bedroom window, where a soft light still glowed. Her granddaughter didn't need to see this, not tonight, not ever. The police officer who took her report seemed bored, scribbling notes without looking up. Probably just kids, he said, though they both knew better. Miss Thelma signed the complaint form, knowing nothing would come of it. The next morning at school, the whispers followed Ayanna through the halls like shadows. Students moved aside when she passed, some with fear, others with barely concealed hostility. She kept her eyes forward, her father's training evident in every measured step. The locker room was empty when she entered for gym class. The word "savage" stretched across her locker in thick black marker, the letters dripping slightly as if the ink was still wet. Ayanna studied it for a moment, then pulled paper towels from the dispenser and began methodically erasing each letter. By the time other students filtered in, the word was gone, though a faint shadow remained. Ayanna changed into her gym clothes as if nothing had happened, her movements precise and controlled. That night, in the safety of her room, she opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. The word appeared again under her pencil, but this time she added flames licking at the edges of each letter. The fire didn't consume the word, it transformed it, made it glow with defiance rather than hatred. She scanned the drawing carefully, adjusting the contrast until the flames seemed to dance on the screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she created a new anonymous account. The username SilentFire appeared in clean text against the white background. The first panel set up loaded slowly, the word surrounded by flames, then dissolving into ash, then reforming as a phoenix rising. She added no caption, no explanation. The art spoke for itself. For hours, nothing happened. Then a comment appeared. This is powerful. Another followed. I feel this in my bones. More comments trickled in, then poured. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. Keep drawing, please. The follower count climbed steadily. 100, 200, 300. Each number represented someone who saw, who understood. Ayana didn't respond to any comments. She simply watched as her silent truth spread across screens and hearts, her father's dog tags cool against her skin. Her art spoke volumes in the digital silence. Each panel was a word she couldn't say, each drawing a truth she needed to share. She never asked to be heard, had learned long ago that some voices were systematically silenced. But now, through lines and shadows and carefully crafted flames, the whole world was starting to listen anyway. Miss Thelma noticed her granddaughter spending more time at her desk that night, but didn't ask questions. She simply brought up a cup of hot chocolate and kissed the top of Ayana's head, noting the fierce concentration in those young eyes as she worked on another panel. Whatever battle Ayana was fighting, she was finding her own way to win it. Not with fists or words, but with art that burned bright enough to illuminate the darkness. The cafe's evening crowd had thinned to a handful of regulars when Mrs. Grange pushed through the glass door, a manila envelope tucked under her arm. The bell chimed softly as she scanned the room, her eyes settling on a woman in the corner booth who was stirring her coffee with mechanical precision. Lucia Morales looked older than Mrs. Grange remembered. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and silver streaked through her once black hair. She'd been Maple Hill's most dedicated social worker until her sudden departure 3 years ago. Now she worked at a private practice 2 towns over. "Thank you for meeting me," Mrs. Grange said, sliding into the booth. The vinyl seat squeaked beneath her. Lucia managed a tired smile. "Your message sounded urgent. Though I have to admit, I was surprised to hear from anyone from Maple Hill." Mrs. Grange placed the envelope on the table between them. Her fingers lingered on its worn edges before she pushed it toward Lucia. The name, Malik Evans, was written across the top in faded blue ink. The change in Lucia's expression was immediate. The polite smile vanished, replaced by something that looked like pain mixed with anger. Her coffee spoon clattered against the ceramic mug. "Where did you get this?" Lucia's voice was barely above a whisper. "It was buried in the archived files. Someone tried to redact most of it, but they missed a few things." Mrs. Grange leaned forward. "What happened to him, Lucia?" Lucia's hands trembled slightly as she touched the envelope. "They told me to stop asking questions after he left. Said it was a resolved matter." "Resolved?" She laughed bitterly. Nothing was resolved. The waitress approached their table, but one look at their faces made her turn away. Mrs. Grange waited while Lucia gathered her thoughts. "Malik was such a bright kid," Lucia finally continued. "Honor roll student, helped tutor younger children at the community center. But some of the other students, they made his life hell. Racial slurs in the hallways, jokes about his father being in prison. His father was a pediatrician, for God's sake." She opened the envelope carefully, spreading out the documents. Most pages were heavily redacted, black marks obscuring entire paragraphs. But between the censored sections, a pattern emerged. 6 documented complaints of racist bullying, Lucia said, pointing to the dates. "I filed every single one myself. The administration kept saying they were investigating, but nothing changed. If anything, it got worse." Mrs. Grange nodded, her jaw tight. "And then the altercation happened?" 3 boys cornered him in the locker room after gym class. They'd been harassing him for weeks, but this time... Lucia's voice cracked. "This time they had a knife. Said they were going to teach him his place. Malik fought back, broke one boy's nose. Next thing I knew, he was suspended for excessive force in a non-life-threatening situation." The phrase made Mrs. Grange's stomach turn. The exact same words they'd used in Ayana's case. 2 weeks later, his family moved away. No forwarding address, no transfer records, nothing. It was like they'd never existed. Lucia's fingers clenched around her coffee cup. "I tried to follow up, but every door slammed shut. The administration said the matter was closed. The board threatened legal action if I pursued it. Eventually, they pushed me out too." Mrs. Grange pulled out her tablet and showed Lucia the school's current disciplinary statistics. "Look at the pattern. Every student suspended for excessive force in the past 5 years, all children of color. all after defending themselves, all with missing or corrupted security footage. Lucia's eyes scanned the numbers, her expression hardening. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They just bury it deeper. Miles away in her bedroom, Ayanna sat at her desk, her lamp casting a warm glow over her sketchbook. The house was quiet except for the soft scratch of her pencil against paper. She'd been drawing for hours, letting the images flow from some deep place inside her. The piece took shape slowly. A boy suspended in dark water, surrounded by school desks that seemed to be pulling him down. His hands reached upward, but the surface was too far away. No one stood at the edges to help. No one even seemed to notice he was drowning. Ayanna worked until every detail was perfect. The terror in the boy's eyes, the weight of the institutional furniture dragging him into darkness, the empty chairs where witnesses should have been. She didn't know Malik's story yet, but somehow she knew this truth. Silence could kill as surely as violence. When the drawing was complete, she scanned it carefully, adjusting the contrast until the shadows seemed to move on screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, typing the title, "Where Did He Go?" The post went live at exactly midnight. Within minutes, comments began appearing. "This is exactly how it feels. I know someone this happened to. Who's going to save him?" Back in her office the next morning, Mrs. Grange printed Ayanna's latest piece. The image was stark in black and white, somehow more haunting on paper than on screen. She hung it carefully on her wall, right beside Malik's file. The two pieces of evidence, one in bureaucratic text, one in artistic metaphor, told the same story from different angles. A story of systematic erasure, of children fighting alone against a tide of institutionalized racism, of voices silenced one by one. Mrs. Grange took a post-it note from her desk. Her hand was steady as she wrote, "This time, someone will be held accountable." She pinned it beneath Ayanna's drawing, where it served as both promise and prayer. The morning light streamed through her office window, illuminating the wall of evidence she'd gathered. Malik's file, Ayanna's art, statistics that couldn't be explained away. A pattern too clear to ignore. Mrs. Grange knew with absolute certainty that the roots of this problem went deeper than one incident, one student, one school. This wasn't just about Ayanna anymore. It never was. It was about every child who'd been silenced, every family forced to move away, every truth buried under redacted files and corrupted footage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front yard as Miss Thelma stepped out to check the mail. Her worn slippers crunched against the frost-covered grass, each step measured and careful. But when she reached the mailbox, her breath caught in her throat. A thick envelope was taped to the metal surface, its official letterhead gleaming in the early light. With trembling fingers, she pulled it free, her eyes scanning the first page. The words, "Civil Summons," stood out in bold letters, followed by a list of plaintiffs, the Rourkes, the Mitchells, the Martins. The document blurred as she read further. Assault, emotional trauma, damages sought. Numbers with too many zeros. Miss Thelma's hand pressed against her chest as she backed away from the mailbox, clutching the papers. The walk back to the house seemed longer than before. Each step felt heavy, as if her feet were made of lead. When she finally reached the door, she closed it with deliberate gentleness, though everything inside her wanted to slam it shut. Her heart thundered in her chest as she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. In the kitchen, Ayanna sat at the breakfast table working on her math homework. She looked up as her grandmother entered, immediately noticing the slight shake in the older woman's hands as she filled the kettle for tea. Without a word, Ayanna rose from her chair and moved to the counter. She gently took the spoon from her grandmother's trembling fingers and began stirring the tea herself, adding just the right amount of honey, the way she'd watched Miss Thelma do countless times before. Miss Thelma's eyes welled with tears at the simple gesture, but she blinked them back quickly. She wouldn't let Ayanna see her break. Not now. Not when they needed strength more than ever. That evening, after sending Ayanna to bed, Miss Thelma sat at the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and her muffled voice. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," she whispered to her sister. "The legal fees alone." Her voice cracked. "We don't have the money for this. Everything went to moving here after—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but her sister understood. Unknown to her, Ayanna sat at the top of the stairs, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. The sound of her grandmother's quiet sobs traveled up the stairwell, each one striking like a physical blow. But instead of crying herself, Ayanna drew. Her pencil moved with purpose across the paper, creating bold, sure strokes. Under her careful hand, her grandmother took shape, not as the worried woman at the kitchen table, but as a magnificent mountain. The lines were strong, depicting weathered stone marked with deep fissures but standing tall and unmoved. Cracks ran through the mountain's face, but they seemed to glow from within, as if the breaks only revealed inner strength. The next day at school, the halls felt different. Students whispered as Ayanna passed, their eyes following her with new interest. News of the lawsuit had spread fast in their small town. Griffin Rourke strutted past her locker, his wrist brace now more of an accessory than a necessity. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he caught her eye. "See you in court, psycho," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few students laughed nervously, others looked away uncomfortably. But it was Ty Martin who caught Ayanna's attention. He lingered at the edge of the group, no longer flanking Griffin like a loyal shadow. His eyes looked sunken, haunted by something he couldn't or wouldn't say. When Griffin called him to follow, Ty's steps were mechanical, reluctant. The afternoon sun was setting when a knock echoed through the coal house. Miss Thelma opened the door to find Mrs. Grange standing on the porch, her gray hair neat despite the wind, a worn leather briefcase clutched in her hand. "May I come in?" the librarian asked, her voice carrying a strength Miss Thelma hadn't heard before. In the living room, Mrs. Grange set her briefcase on the coffee table with careful precision. "Before I was a librarian," she began, "I spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney. My license is still valid. I just reactivated it this morning." She opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of documents, photographs, and USB drives. "They think they can bully you into silence with legal threats, but they don't know what we have." Miss Thelma leaned forward, her eyes scanning the materials spread before her. "What exactly do we have?" "Evidence," Mrs. Grange replied, pulling out a folder. "Years of documented patterns, testimonies from former students, statistical analysis of disciplinary actions, and something they never expected, Ayanna's art. Every piece she's posted tells a story they can't deny." She placed a hand on Miss Thelma's shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. "If they want to fight, they'll get one, and this time, we come with evidence." Ayanna stood in the doorway watching the two women bend over the documents. Her fingers itched for her pencils, wanting to capture this moment, not of defeat, but of rising strength. They thought she had no voice, but they were wrong. She had something more powerful now, truth, and someone who knew how to use it. Behind Maple Hill Middle School, where the building's shadow stretched long across browning grass, Ty Martin sat alone on a concrete bench. His phone glowed in his trembling hands as he scrolled through an online art account that had been making waves through the school. Everyone knew who was behind it, even if no one said it out loud. The artwork was unmistakable. Each panel told a story that made Ty's stomach twist with guilt. There was the locker room scene, drawn in stark black and white, 3 figures cornering a smaller one, scissors glinting. The cafeteria view showed empty seats around a solitary figure, while faces turned away in exaggerated disgust. The hallway sketch captured sneering faces and pointing fingers with haunting accuracy. But it was the newest piece that made Ty's hands shake. Griffin and Jace stood tall in the foreground, but their shadows stretched behind them like wolves, all teeth and hunger and cruelty. Ty searched the drawing for his own shadow, his own wolf, but found nothing. The artist had left him out entirely, and somehow that felt worse than being painted as a monster. The autumn wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across his feet. Ty closed his eyes, but the memories came anyway, flooding back with painful clarity. It was just last summer. His brother Matt had finally worked up the courage to bring Marcus, his boyfriend, to the annual bonfire at Lake Ridge. Ty remembered how proud Matt looked, holding Marcus's hand as they approached the fire. Marcus wore a bright smile despite the stares, his dark skin glowing golden in the firelight. Griffin had been there with his older cousins. Their laughter turned ugly fast. "Didn't know you were into chocolate," one of them had called out. Others joined in, their words getting meaner, sharper. Matt and Marcus left early, but Ty saw the hurt in both their eyes. Three days later, Matt came home with a broken nose and cracked ribs. He wouldn't say who did it, but Ty had seen Griffin's scraped knuckles at school the next day. Had heard him bragging in whispers to Jace about teaching that fairy a lesson. Ty never said a word. Not to his parents, not to the police, not to anyone. Matt and Marcus moved to Philadelphia soon after. Now Matt only came home for holidays, and even then, he barely spoke to Ty. The memory sat like acid in Ty's stomach as he stared at Ayana's artwork. Each stroke of her pencil felt like an accusation. He'd been silent then, just like he'd been silent every time Griffin and Jace targeted Ayana. Different victim, same cowardice. The library doors felt heavier than usual as Ty pushed them open. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows between the bookshelves. He found Ayana in her usual spot, tucked away in the reference section with her sketchbook open before her. His footsteps seemed too loud on the carpeted floor. Each step forward took more courage than the last. Ayana didn't look up as he approached, her pencil moving steadily across the paper. "I'm sorry," Ty whispered, his voice cracking. His hands gripped the edge of the table to stop their shaking. "I didn't stop them. Any of it." Ayana's pencil paused mid-stroke. She looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no forgiveness there, but no hatred either. Just a steady, measuring gaze that seemed to see right through him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Ty wanted to say more. About Matt, about Griffin, about all the times he'd watched and done nothing. But his throat closed up, and all he could do was stand there trembling under the weight of his guilt. After what felt like hours, Ayana returned to her drawing. The dismissal was clear, but somehow not unkind. Ty backed away, his confession hanging in the air like smoke. That evening, a new piece appeared on Ayana's account. It showed a wolf, fierce and threatening at first glance. But as the panels progressed, the wolf's fur began to peel away like a mask, revealing underneath not a monster but a boy with frightened eyes and shoulders bent by shame. Ty stared at the image for a long time, tears blurring his vision. She had seen him, really seen him, and drawn not what he'd done, but what he could be. It felt like both an indictment and an invitation. The next morning, before anyone else arrived at school, Ty slipped a sealed envelope under Mrs. Grange's office door. Inside were pages of careful notes, dates of incidents, names of witnesses, combinations to lockers where phones might hold incriminating videos. Every ugly truth he'd carried silently for years, laid out in trembling handwriting. Mrs. Grange found the envelope when she arrived. She added it to a growing file labeled Evidence, a folder that was getting thicker by the day. The librarian's fingers traced over the names and dates, her expression grim but determined. Each new piece of information was another crack in the wall of silence that had protected bullies like Griffin for so long. The cracks in their armor were starting to show, and Ayana hadn't even spoken yet. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual lunchtime chaos, but Ayana sat alone at her corner table, methodically unwrapping her sandwich. Her father's dog tags hung heavy against her chest under her hoodie, a constant reminder of his presence. She glanced down at the smartwatch on her wrist, its sleek black face catching the fluorescent light. The sight of it transported her back 2 years, to a sun-drenched morning in their garage in North Carolina. Her father sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, his laptop balanced on his knees. Ayana watched, fascinated, as his fingers flew across the keyboard. "Come here, baby girl," he'd said, patting the space beside him. "Let me show you something important." Ayana had settled next to him, breathing in his familiar scent of coffee and mint gum. On the screen, lines of code scrolled past as he explained. "This is a special program I made," he said, his voice gentle but serious. It turns any smart device into a security camera, motion-triggered, always ready. He picked up her new smartwatch, a birthday gift he'd given her that morning, and started downloading the app. "Why do I need it?" she'd asked one of the last times she'd spoken easily. His dark eyes had met hers, filled with a knowledge that came from years of being a black man in America. "Because sometimes, baby, when you see something wrong happening, nobody wants to believe you, so you keep a record. Always." He squeezed her shoulder. Evidence doesn't lie, even when people do. Back in the present, Ayana's fingers traced the watch's smooth edge. That morning in the locker room, before Griffin and his friends cornered her, she'd felt the wrongness coming. Years of training with her father had honed her instincts. She'd seen the way Griffin's hand kept touching his hoodie pocket, how Ty and Jace had positioned themselves to block the exits. When they'd surrounded her, her father's voice had echoed in her head. Evidence doesn't lie. With practiced subtlety, she'd activated the app with 2 quick taps. The footage was crystal clear. The watch, secured firmly on her wrist, captured everything from the perfect angle. Griffin's sneer as he pulled out the scissors. The way he'd said, "Bet if we cut that hair off, she'd finally say something." Jace and Ty grabbing her arms. The cold touch of steel against her braid. Then came her response. Controlled, precise movements her father had drilled into her countless times. No excessive force, just enough to neutralize the threat. The video showed it all, unedited and undoctored. 6 seconds of pure truth. That evening, after dinner, Ayana went to her room and carefully transferred the footage to a secure drive. Another trick her father had taught her. She held the small device in her palm, feeling its weight. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about Malik Evans, about her brother Matt, about every student who'd been silenced by Maple Hill's system of convenient erasure. Walking back downstairs, she found Miss Thelma and Mrs. Grange in deep discussion at the kitchen table, surrounded by legal papers and old case files. They looked up as she approached. Without ceremony, Ayana placed the drive in the center of the table. Both women stared at it, then at her. "You've had this all along?" Miss Thelma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayana nodded once, her face calm but her eyes intense. Mrs. Grange picked up the drive, understanding dawning in her expression. "Then it's time we show the truth," she said, a smile spreading across her face. The same smile she'd worn in old photographs from her civil rights cases. The smile of someone who knew justice was finally within reach. The next morning arrived clear and cold. Mrs. Grange walked into the courthouse with purpose in her stride, carrying a thick folder of documents. Inside was not just a motion to dismiss the charges against Ayana, but a comprehensive countersuit exposing years of racial misconduct and administrative cover-ups at Maple Hill School. The motion detailed everything: the missing footage from the gym cameras, the suspicious gaps in student records, the pattern of disproportionate discipline against students of color. And at its heart was Ayana's video, irrefutable proof that would shatter the school's carefully constructed narrative. They had tried to erase the truth, to control the story as they always had, but they hadn't counted on a quiet girl with her father's training and her own fierce determination. They'd erased their tape, but Ayana never needed theirs. She had made her own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Maple Hill County Courthouse, its weathered brick facade looming over the small crowd gathering for the day's proceedings. Miss Thelma stood with Ayana near the entrance, her weathered hands gentle but firm as she adjusted the collar of her granddaughter's navy blue dress. "You don't have to speak," Miss Thelma whispered, smoothing down an errant curl that had escaped Ayana's neat braids. "Just be there." Her voice carried the weight of generations who had stood before similar courts, fighting similar battles. Ayana's fingers tightened around her worn sketchbook, its pages filled with the truth she wouldn't speak aloud. Her other hand reached up to touch her father's dog tags beneath her collar, the metal warm against her skin. The familiar ritual centered her, just as it had every morning since they'd arrived in this town. Mrs. Grange approached them, her briefcase clutched firmly in one hand. She wore a crisp charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes kind but determined. Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches creaked as people settled in. Griffin's parents sat in the front row, their son between them wearing a pressed shirt and his wrist still wrapped in an unnecessary brace. Behind them, Jace's family huddled close while Ty sat apart from the others, his shoulders hunched and eyes fixed on the floor. The Bullies' lawyer, Mr. Peterson, rose from his seat with practiced grace. His expensive suit and carefully styled hair spoke of countless victories in rooms just like this one. He approached the jury with measured steps, his voice dripping with concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing toward Griffin and the others. "What we have here is a tragedy. 3 young men, good boys from good families, traumatized by an unprovoked attack." He paused, letting his words sink in. These boys were cornered and assaulted by a child who has demonstrated consistent antisocial behavior, who refuses to speak, who has shown signs of deep instability. Ayanna sat perfectly still, her face a mask of calm that her father had taught her to wear in moments of stress. Miss Thelma's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. Peterson turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence of the incident." He nodded to his assistant, who wheeled in a large screen. The footage that played was grainy, clearly taken from a student's phone. It showed only the end of the confrontation, Ayanna's swift, precise movements as she defended herself. The video had been carefully edited to remove any context, making her actions appear unprovoked and excessive. "As you can see," Peterson continued, his voice heavy with manufactured dismay, "this was not self-defense. This was a violent outburst from a troubled individual." Mrs. Grange stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor, this edited footage presents an incomplete and misleading account of events." Judge Collier, a man with steel-gray hair and deep-set eyes, looked down from his bench. His friendship with Principal Halpern was well known in Maple Hill's small circles. "Overruled," he said firmly. "The footage speaks for itself." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Griffin's mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while his father nodded approvingly. Ty's face had grown even paler, his hands clenched in his lap. Ayanna continued to sit motionless, but her mind was racing through memories of that morning with her father, learning to install the app that would later prove so crucial. She could almost hear his voice. "Evidence doesn't lie, baby girl." When Peterson finally took his seat, satisfaction evident in his slight smile, Mrs. Grange rose. Her movements were unhurried, confident. She adjusted her glasses and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. "We'd like to enter new evidence," she announced, her voice clear and steady, "from the defendant's smartwatch." A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. Peterson's smile faltered slightly. Judge Collier's eyebrows drew together. Ayanna stood without being prompted, her movements fluid and controlled. The sketchbook remained on the table as she approached the bench, the flash drive held carefully in her hand. She'd drawn this moment too, a small figure offering up truth like a flame in the darkness. Judge Collier looked down at her, then at the flash drive she held out. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, perhaps remembering conversations with Halpern, perhaps weighing the consequences of what this evidence might reveal. But there was something in Ayanna's steady gaze that made him pause. She stood before him, not as a victim or an aggressor, but as a witness to her own truth. Finally, he nodded. "Evidence will be admitted," he declared, gesturing to the clerk to take the drive. The lights in the courtroom dimmed as the projector hummed to life. Ayanna returned to her seat between Miss Thelma and Mrs. Grange, her heart beating steady and strong like her father had taught her. The real story was about to begin. The first frame appeared on screen, crystal clear and unedited. The timestamp showed the exact date and time, and the angle from Ayanna's wrist captured everything in perfect detail. Griffin's face appeared, twisted with malice as he pulled the scissors from his hoodie. Jace and Ty moved into position, their intentions clear in their stance and expressions. In the present, Griffin's carefully constructed mask of innocence began to crack. His mother's hand flew to her mouth. Ty closed his eyes, unable to watch his own actions played back in unforgiving clarity. The real story began to play, and with it the truth that no amount of editing could erase. The video played with devastating clarity on the courthouse screen, each frame a testament to truth that could no longer be denied. The smartwatch footage showed the locker room from Ayana's perspective, the angle capturing every detail with unwavering precision. Griffin's face filled the frame first, his features twisted with cruel intent rather than the innocent expression he now wore in court. "Let's see if we can make the statue talk." Griffin's voice rang clear through the speakers, the scissors glinting in his hand. The time-stamp in the corner blinked steadily, matching the school's official records down to the second. The courtroom watched in complete silence as Jace moved behind Ayana, his grip rough as he grabbed her arms. Ty lingered at the edge of the frame, his reluctance visible even then as he shifted from foot to foot. The video showed Griffin advancing, the scissors raised toward Ayana's braids that Miss Thelma had carefully woven that very morning. What happened next drew audible gasps from the gallery. Ayana's movements were controlled, precise, nothing like the wild assault Peterson had described. Each defensive motion was measured, causing only enough pain to stop the attack. The video showed her striking Ty's knee with calculated force, using Jace's own momentum to flip him, and applying just enough pressure to Griffin's wrist to make him drop the scissors. 6 seconds. That's all it took. The timestamp proved it. In the present moment, the courtroom remained frozen in shocked silence. The reporter from the local paper had stopped writing, her pen hovering above her notepad. The jury members leaned forward, several of them shaking their heads in disbelief. One elderly juror removed his glasses to wipe them, as if doubting what he'd just witnessed. Griffin's mother, who had been so theatrical with her tissues earlier, now sat rigid in her seat. Her perfectly manicured hand covered her mouth, but not in the performative way she'd displayed before. Real shock had replaced her affected concern. Beside her, Griffin seemed to shrink in his chair, the fraudulent wrist brace suddenly appearing ridiculous against the evidence of what he'd actually done. Jace's father, a tall man who had stood proudly behind his son throughout the proceedings, now stared at the floor, his jaw clenched tight with shame. His son's actions, stripped of excuses and editing, lay bare before the entire community. Ty had completely crumpled in on himself, face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook slightly, whether from relief that the truth was finally out or shame at his own part in it. It wasn't clear. Judge Collier's composure cracked for the first time since the trial began. His friendship with Principal Halpern seemed to weigh heavily on him as he cleared his throat. "Is this timestamp accurate?" he asked, his voice unusually uncertain. Mrs. Grange stood, her posture straight and confident. "Yes, Your Honor. The timestamp is synced with the school's own system. We can provide technical verification if needed." She paused, letting the implications sink in. This means the school's claim about their security cameras being under maintenance that day raises some very interesting questions. The gallery erupted in whispers. Miss Thelma reached across the table, taking Ayana's hand in hers. Her grip was warm, steady, a lifetime of strength flowing from grandmother to granddaughter. Ayana remained still, her expression calm as she watched the truth she'd carried for so long finally come to light. Then, from somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a voice hissed, "Liar!" The word hung in the air like poison. Miss Thelma's hand tightened around Ayana's, but to her surprise, Ayana was already moving. She stood slowly, deliberately, her father's dog tags catching the light as she rose. The entire courtroom turned to look at her. Griffin's smirk had vanished completely. Ty finally lifted his face from his hands. Judge Collier leaned forward slightly in his chair. Even Mrs. Grange seemed surprised by this unexpected movement from her young client. Ayana stood perfectly straight, just as her father had taught her. Her voice, unused in public for 2 years, came out clear and quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hushed room. "This is what really happened," she said, each word measured and precise. Then, her eyes sweeping across the faces of those who had tried to bury the truth, she added, "And it wasn't just me." The impact of her words, simple, direct, and devastating, rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. The reporter's pen clattered to the floor. Griffin's mother grabbed her husband's arm. Judge Collier's face had gone pale. These were not just the words of a silent girl finding her voice. They were an indictment of a system that had failed not only her but others before her. They were a promise that the truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. The fire had spoken, and now the system had to answer. The courthouse video spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, clips of Ayana's defense against her attackers dominated every platform, her face thoughtfully blurred by concerned netizens who shared it. The timestamp overlay became a focal point, clear proof that contradicted the school's claims about missing footage. Silent Fire began trending nationally by midnight. Social justice advocates, anti-bullying organizations, and civil rights groups amplified the story. News vans lined up outside Maple Hill Middle School the next morning, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Local reporters dug deeper into the school's history, uncovering similar incidents that had been quietly buried. Parents of former students came forward with their own stories. The comment sections under every article filled with both support and vitriol, reflecting the deep divide that had always existed in Maple Hill, but now lay exposed for all to see. Principal Halpern's resignation came via email at 3 a.m., a tersely worded message citing personal reasons for his immediate departure. By breakfast, Judge Collier faced an ethics investigation for his apparent bias and connections to the school administration. The school board called an emergency meeting, their carefully worded statement about reviewing policies and commitment to diversity, ringing hollow against the evidence of their past inaction. But as public outrage grew, so did the backlash. Miss Thelma discovered it first, the harsh smell of spray paint hitting her nose before she saw the words scrawled across their garage door. "Go back to the jungle." The letters dripped black and ugly in the morning light. She tried to clean it before Ayana could see, but her granddaughter was already there, taking pictures with her phone. Silent, methodical, just like her father had taught her to document everything. That night, the sound of metal scraping against metal woke them both. Through the window, they watched shadows dart away from their car, now bearing deep gouges along its sides. Before they could process this violation, orange light flared in the darkness. Their mailbox transformed into a torch, flames licking at the night sky. Miss Thelma called the police. 2 officers arrived, took notes with obvious disinterest, and suggested it was probably just kids letting off steam. They promised to increase patrols but left without taking fingerprints or collecting evidence. Their patrol car's taillights disappeared around the corner, never to return. The next morning, Miss Thelma moved slower than usual as she prepared breakfast. Her hands trembled slightly as she cracked eggs into a bowl. Ayana noticed. She always noticed everything. But before she could react, her grandmother's eyes rolled back. The bowl shattered on the kitchen floor as Miss Thelma collapsed. Ayana moved with the same controlled precision she'd shown in the locker room. She checked her grandmother's pulse, placed her in the recovery position, and dialed 911. Her voice, clear and steady, gave the dispatcher their address and symptoms. "My grandmother collapsed. She's breathing but unresponsive. She has high blood pressure. We're at 1247 Maple Street." The paramedics arrived within minutes. They praised Ayana's quick thinking as they loaded Miss Thelma into the ambulance. One of them tried to make conversation, asking if Ayana was scared, but she had retreated back into her silence, watching with sharp eyes as they took her only remaining family away. Standing alone in her room that night, Ayana felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The house seemed too big, too quiet without Miss Thelma's humming or the soft sounds of her moving around the kitchen. The silence that had once been Ayana's shield now felt heavy, suffocating. She walked to her laptop and opened the video file she'd watched countless times before, her father's last call. The image was frozen on his final smile, eternally paused between words of love and static. His marine hoodie, the same one she now wore, looked crisp and clean in the grainy footage. Ayana moved to the center of her room, bare feet planted firmly on the carpet. She raised her hands into a fighting stance, just as her father had taught her on their rooftop sessions. Her form was perfect, guard up, elbows in, weight balanced. The first punch cut through the air with precise control, then another, and another. Each strike flowed into the next, a silent dance of discipline and power. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but her form never wavered. Her breathing remained steady even as her chest ached with emotion. This wasn't the wild fighting of someone seeking revenge. Each movement was measured, protective. The techniques her father had taught her not for hurting others, but for defending what mattered most. She shadowboxed in the dim light of her room, her father's frozen smile watching over her grandmother's absence an ache in her heart. Her strikes weren't aimed at Griffin or his friends anymore. They weren't even aimed at the cowards who had vandalized their home. Each punch and block was a promise to protect, to endure, to stand firm. Just as her father had taught her. Just as her grandmother had shown her every day. Sweat mixed with tears on her face, but Ayanna didn't stop. Her movements remained controlled, disciplined, focused. She wasn't fighting against hate anymore. She was fighting for love. For her grandmother in the hospital. For her father's memory. For every student who had ever been silenced. The moonlight cast her shadow on the wall, a small figure moving with warrior's grace, her father's dog tags swaying gently against her chest with each precise movement. She trained not for vengeance now, but for defense of everything she loves. Mrs. Grange's fingers traced the edges of old case files spread across her desk as Lucia Morales paced nearby, phone pressed to her ear. The former social worker's determined expression brightened as she scribbled down an address. "That's it. They're in Pittsburgh now," Lucia said, hanging up. "My contact at Child Services there confirmed it. The Evans family moved there right after Malik left Maple Hill." Mrs. Grange nodded, already gathering the documents into her briefcase. "How far is that?" "About 4 hours. I can drive," Lucia offered, her dark eyes reflecting the same urgency that had kept them both working late into the evening. The next morning, their car wound through Pittsburgh's residential streets, past rows of brick houses with narrow yards. They found the Evans home, a modest 2-story with potted plants on the porch steps. Mrs. Grange smoothed her blazer before ringing the doorbell. A woman answered, her tired eyes immediately narrowing with suspicion. "Mrs. Evans?" Grange asked gently. "I'm Barbara Grange, and this is Lucia Morales. We're here about what happened at Maple Hill." Mrs. Evans' hand tightened on the door frame. "We left that behind us," she said firmly. "Ma'am?" Lucia stepped forward, her voice soft but urgent. "We're investigating a pattern of discrimination there. Your son wasn't the only one they pushed out. It's still happening." Mrs. Evans studied them for a long moment, then glanced over her shoulder into the house. Finally, she stepped back. "Come in, but keep your voices down. Malik doesn't like talking about it." Inside, they sat at a kitchen table scattered with college brochures and GED preparation materials. Mrs. Evans twisted her wedding ring as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started when Malik stood up for Maria Rodriguez. Some boys were following her in the hallway, calling her horrible names. Illegal, wetback." She closed her eyes at the memory. Malik got between them. There was a push, nothing more. But suddenly he was labeled aggressive and dangerous. Mrs. Grange's pen moved steadily across her notepad as Mrs. Evans continued. "Principal Halpern called us in, said Malik had a pattern of confrontational behavior, said he was a threat to school safety. But when we asked to see these other incidents, they couldn't show us anything." "They suspended him?" Lucia prompted gently. 3 days at first, then they extended it to 2 weeks. Then Halpern suggested we should consider other options. Said it would be better for everyone if Malik transferred quietly." Her voice cracked. "We tried to appeal, but they had already marked his record. No other school in the district would take him." She stood abruptly, walking to a drawer and pulling out a manila envelope. "Here's everything. The transfer papers, the discipline reports, even the letter Halpern wrote recommending against his admission to other schools. We kept it all, though I don't know why anymore." Mrs. Grange carefully photographed each document while Lucia recorded Mrs. Evans's statement on her phone. The mother's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if each word lifted a weight she'd carried too long. "Malik hasn't been the same since. He tried another school here, but..." She gestured at the GED materials. The trust was gone. He couldn't sit in classrooms anymore without looking over his shoulder. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Evans caught Mrs. Grange's arm. "Why now? Why are you looking into this after all this time?" "Because another student showed us that silence doesn't equal safety," Mrs. Grange answered, "and because it's time someone finally stood up to them." On the drive back to Maple Hill, Lucia made calls to her contacts at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. "The pattern is clear now," she explained, reading from her notes. "Multiple incidents, similar tactics, always targeting minority students. Yes, I can send you the documentation. Yes, we have witness statements." Meanwhile, in the halls of Maple Hill Middle School, Ty Martin stood at Ayana's locker long after most students had left. His hands shook slightly as he slipped a folded note through the vent. The words had taken him hours to write, each one weighted with truth he'd kept buried. "I'm sorry, I'll testify if you want about my brother, about everything." He hurried away before anyone could see him, but the weight in his chest felt lighter. That same weight had been crushing him since the night his brother Matt was attacked, since he'd recognized Griffin's voice among the laughing shadows that had left Matt bleeding behind the movie theater. His brother's crime? Holding hands with his boyfriend, who happened to be black. That evening, Ayana sat cross-legged on her bed, her drawing tablet balanced on her knees. Her stylus moved with purpose, creating bold lines that formed familiar shapes. A figure emerged, herself, standing tall, holding up a glowing lantern. Behind her, more figures stepped out of the shadows into the light's reach. She drew Malik first, his stance uncertain but moving forward. Then the Latina girl he'd defended, her chin lifted defiantly. Matt, Ty's brother, took shape next, his outline strong despite the shadows trying to swallow him. More figures emerged, every student who'd been pushed aside marked as dangerous or forced into silence. The finished piece showed them all walking forward, following the light of Ayana's lantern. Their shadows stretched behind them, but they weren't hiding anymore. They were stepping into view, claiming their space, refusing to be erased. Ayana uploaded the image to her account, her cursor hovering for just a moment before adding the caption, "We're not invisible anymore." The system had tried to erase them, but Ayana redrew every line. The marble halls of the state courthouse echoed with footsteps as people filed in for the school misconduct inquiry. Ayana sat on a polished wooden bench outside the main chamber, her sketchbook balanced carefully on her lap. Mrs. Grange sat beside her, reviewing notes with steady hands and occasional glances at her young client. Miss Thelma Cole occupied the space on Ayana's other side, her newly acquired cane propped against the bench. The hospital stay had left her thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. But she held her chin high, spine straight, despite the fatigue evident in the slight tremor of her hands. "Remember," Mrs. Grange said softly, "you only need to speak if you're ready. The evidence speaks volumes on its own." Ayana nodded, her fingers tracing the spiral binding of her sketchbook. She wore a pressed navy blazer over a white blouse, an outfit that made her look older than her 12 years. Her father's dog tags remained tucked beneath the collar, a familiar weight against her chest. The chamber doors opened and they filed in with the others. The room was larger than the civil court, with high ceilings and rows of wooden seats. At the front, a panel of 5 state education board members sat behind a curved desk, with the lead investigator, Judge Martinez, at the center. Mrs. Evans was called first. She approached the podium clutching typed papers that shook slightly in her grip. Her voice, however, remained steady as she read, "My son Malik was 13 when Maple Hill Middle School labeled him a threat. His crime was defending a classmate from racial harassment. The school's response was to remove him, not the harassers. They buried his appeals, marked his record, and forced us to leave the district entirely. Today, my son struggles to trust any educational institution. But his story isn't unique. It's part of a pattern that has silenced and displaced too many children of color in this community." Lucia Morales followed, wheeling a cart of documents to the podium. Her professional demeanor carried the weight of years spent fighting similar battles. She methodically presented file after file, disciplinary records showing stark racial disparities, sealed incident reports, and internal communications revealing administrative bias. In the past 5 years, Lucia stated, minority students at Maple Hill were 3 times more likely to receive severe disciplinary action for similar infractions compared to white students. In cases involving conflict between white and minority students, 89% resulted in the minority student being labeled as the aggressor, regardless of witness statements or evidence to the contrary. The panel members leaned forward, examining the statistics and sealed documents. Judge Martinez's expression remained neutral, but her pen moved constantly across her notepad. Then Ty Martin approached the podium. His usual slouch was gone, replaced by rigid tension. His voice cracked as he began, "I was part of it. I helped hurt people because I was scared of being hurt myself. I watched Griffin and others target students of color. I saw what they did to my brother Matt when he dated a black guy." Ty's hands gripped the podium edges. They jumped him behind the movie theater. I recognized their voices. Griffin was there, laughing. I never said anything because I was a coward. From his seat near the front, Griffin started to rise, face flushed with anger. "You lying piece of—" "Silence," Judge Martinez commanded sharply. "One more outburst and you'll be removed." Griffin sank back, but his glare burned into Ty's back as the testimony continued. Mrs. Grange approached last before Ayanna. She moved with practiced precision, presenting evidence methodically. The unedited footage from Ayanna's smartwatch, screenshots of threatening messages sent to the Cole family, documentation of vandalism at their home, the sealed file of Maria Rodriguez, the Latina student expelled after reporting harassment. "This isn't about isolated incidents," Mrs. Grange concluded. "This is about systematic erasure of minority students who dare to stand up for themselves. The pattern is clear, consistent, and deeply rooted in Maple Hill's administrative practices." Finally, Judge Martinez called Ayanna's name. The room fell silent as she walked to the podium, her sketchbook held close. Unlike the civil hearing, there were no tears threatening to fall, no trembling in her hands. She stood straight, channeling her father's military bearing, her grandmother's dignity. She opened her sketchbook to the final page and held it up for the panel to see. The drawing showed a classroom scene, desk after desk, filled with faceless figures slowly gaining definition. Some were black, some Latino, some Asian, some white. Each face emerged from the erasure with increasing clarity, their eyes direct and unflinching. Ayanna's voice, clear and steady, filled the chamber. "You can't erase people like us. You tried. You failed." The silence that followed held the weight of years of buried truths finally surfacing. In that moment, Ayanna stood not just for herself, but for Malik, for Maria, for Matt, for every student whose voice had been stolen by a system designed to silence them. The room remained still, absorbing the power of those simple words and the truth they carried. What Ayanna didn't shout, she drew. What she didn't draw, she carried. But now, the world carries it too. 3 weeks after the state inquiry, autumn painted the trees in brilliant colors along the route to Ayanna's new school. Heritage Academy stood proud against the morning sky, its red brick walls and diverse student body a stark contrast to Maple Hill's sterile corridors. The building seemed to welcome her, warm sunlight glinting off the windows like a gentle invitation. Miss Thelma's car pulled up to the drop-off zone. Though still using her cane, her movements were steadier now, her smile warmer, the lines around her eyes crinkling with genuine relief. "Have a good day, baby," she said, squeezing Ayanna's hand with a tenderness that spoke volumes. "Remember, you belong here." Ayanna stepped out into the crisp morning air, adjusting her backpack against her shoulders. Other students streamed past, some offering quiet good mornings or small waves. No one stared too long or whispered behind their hands. Here she was just another student, not a symbol or a threat. The weight that had pressed against her chest for so long felt lighter with each breath of the cool autumn air. In her first period art class, Ms. Rodriguez, no relation to Maria, but equally passionate about student expression, encouraged the class to explore different mediums. The art room smelled of paint and possibility. Ayana chose her usual pencils but added splashes of watercolor to her work, experimenting with how the colors bled and blended across the page. Her silence was accepted here, not questioned or weaponized. Ms. Rodriguez simply nodded approvingly at her work, respecting the boundary without making it a barrier. During lunch, she sat with a small group of students who shared her interest in art. The cafeteria hummed with conversation, but at her table, there was a comfortable rhythm to the interaction. They didn't press her to speak, instead showing her their own sketches and discussing techniques. One girl, May, was particularly interested in Ayana's use of shadow and light, leaning over to study her notebook with genuine admiration in her eyes. After school, Ayana settled into her bedroom desk, opening her laptop to check the silent fire page. The follower count had grown to millions, with comments pouring in from around the world. Teachers shared how they used her panels to discuss bullying and racial justice. Parents wrote about showing the artwork to their children who struggled to speak up. Her private pain had somehow transformed into a public healing. One message caught her eye. "Dear silent fire artist, I didn't talk for 3 years after my mom died. Everyone called me weird or broken. Your art made me feel seen. Thank you for showing that silence isn't weakness." Ayana traced the words on her screen, feeling the weight of connection. Her fingertips lingered on the message, as though touching the hand of this stranger who understood. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. A single tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness but recognition. In the kitchen, Miss Thelma hummed gospel tunes while preparing Sunday dinner, the familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring filling their home with comfort. Her hospital stay had scared them both, but now she moved with growing strength, even if slower than before. The smell of her famous cornbread and collard greens drew neighbors who had become allies during their fight, their voices and laughter creating a tapestry of community that wrapped around their home. Mrs. Grange visited regularly, sharing updates between bites of Miss Thelma's cooking. Her eyes sparkled with purpose as she talked. She had returned to practicing law part-time, focusing on educational discrimination cases. The DOJ's investigation into Maple Hill continued, with more families coming forward to share their stories, breaking silences that had lasted for generations. News filtered in about the others. Ty's family had moved to Philadelphia, where his brother Matt was attending college. Before leaving, Ty had written Ayana a letter expressing his hope to make things right in his new school, his handwriting uneven but sincere. Griffin and Jace faced 6 months of juvenile probation and mandatory counseling sessions, along with community service at a local cultural center. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. One crisp afternoon, Ayana walked into the wooded area behind Heritage Academy. Tall oaks and maples created a cathedral of rustling leaves above her head, dappled sunlight dancing on the forest floor. She carried her father's dog tags. She had worn them every day since his death, but today felt different. The metal was warm against her palm from being pressed against her skin. Finding a young oak tree with strong branches, she reached up and carefully hung one of the tags. The metal caught the sunlight, sending small flashes through the leaves like Morse code. The other tag remained against her chest, close to her heart, a physical reminder of the strength she carried within. Standing there, she could almost hear her father's voice from their training sessions on the rooftop years ago. Stillness isn't weakness. It's precision, and precision always wins. He had taught her more than just self-defense. He had shown her how to stand her ground without losing herself. The memory of his voice was clearer now, less painful to recall. Ayana settled at the base of the tree, pulling out her sketchbook. Most of its pages were filled with the story of her fight, but the final page remained blank, waiting. She touched her pencil to the paper, making the first careful stroke, letting her hand move with intention and care. A wing emerged, then another. Not angry or aggressive, but graceful and determined. The phoenix she drew wasn't screaming or attacking. It simply rose, quiet but unstoppable, trailing embers that looked like stars. The fire in its wake didn't destroy. It illuminated the path for others to follow. With each stroke of her pencil, she wrote her truth into existence. The quietest fire burns the longest, and sometimes it lights the way for others. If you enjoyed the story of Ayana, If you enjoyed the story of Ayana, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.